So, all right, hi, welcome everyone to our first Crease Noon lecture series of the new academic year. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Elizabeth King. I am the director of Crease, and I'm excited to welcome you to our first event, which the title of Dr. Noonan's talk is From the Imam of Atheism to Orthodox Iran, Russia and Shi'a Islamist Movements, 1970 to the Present. I also want to thank the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies and the Department of Middle East Studies for co-sponsoring and helping to publicize our event today. So just a little bit of introduction to our speaker. Timothy Noonan is a professor for trans-regional cultures of knowledge in the Department of Interdisciplinary and Multiscalar Area Studies at the University of Regensburg. Prior to holding this position, he was acting chair in the Department of Global History at the Free University of Berlin. There he also led a Volkswagen Foundation Freigeist research group devoted to the history of Islam during the Cold War. His research focuses on international history, Russian and Soviet history, and the history of the modern Middle East. His first book, Humanitarian Invasion, Global Development in Cold War Afghanistan, examined the history of international development in Afghanistan during the Cold War, looking particularly at the role of the Soviet Union and Western humanitarian NGOs. His current book project, which we'll probably hear some today, explores Islamist internationalism from the 1950s to the 1980s. Prior to his positions in Germany, Dr. Noonan was a Harvard Academy scholar and received his DPhil in history from the University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He's currently a visiting scholar here at the University of Michigan with the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia as part of our center's collaboration with the Leibniz Science Campus at the University of Regensburg. Before I turn it over to Dr. Noonan for his lecture, I also want to just highlight advertise a few of our upcoming Crease and co-sponsored events that we have coming soon. So later this month on Wednesday, September 27th, at 5:30 p.m. We're excited to be having Dmitry Guikov come to give a lecture on post-Soviet satire in Russia and Ukraine. That will take place here at Weiser upstairs on the 10th floor, but just to note that it's not at noon, it's our evening one at 5:30. Also, I'll draw your attention to starting on October 2nd and going through the month of November. We are co-sponsoring an event with WCEE on their exhibition, Guardian Passage, The Power of Ukrainian Cultural Memory in the Face of War, which will be here next door in room 547. So please take some time to come to check that out as well. And on Wednesday, October 4th, will be our next Crease Noon lecture series, where we'll be hosting Megan Buskey. She'll come to talk about her new book, Unearthing and Reckoning with Ukrainian Family History. That's on Wednesday, October 4th. We also have some flyers, some printed materials out in the hallway with those events, the details about those events, as well as other events, both specifically for Crease, but also some of the other centers that are part of WCE. So you're welcome to take that, or of course see our website. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Noonan, who will give a lecture.
Alrighty, well, thank you so much for having me this afternoon, and thank you for the kind introduction. So before I dive in, I'd just like to thank Liz Malinkin and Gitta Kohler for handling the organizational aspects of my visit to Ann Arbor this September, as well as Professors Genevieve Zubritsky and Benjamin Paloff for inviting me to deliver the lecture today to kick off the term, I guess. I've already profited a lot from my participation in the exchange program between the University of Regensburg and the University of Michigan, and so I hope that I can do something to return the balance this afternoon. And before I dive in, I just want to note that this is a program sponsored by an initiative called the Leibniz Science Campus, which funds, I think, primarily faculty exchanges between Regensburg and Michigan, but if you're at all interested by what I have to say today, or even if you're not interested, I just want to say that I'm very interested in developing exchanges between the US and Germany. So programs like Fulbright, Alexander von Humboldt. If you're a graduate student in particular, or a postdoc, but even if you're an undergraduate, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll be here until the end of September. My email is just my first name dot last name at ur.de. So please feel free to reach out or just come up to me afterwards if you're interested. Let's dive in then. So those of you seeking to understand Russia's relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran today can look no further than the headlines coming out of the Republic of Tatarstan this summer. A Muslim-majority region of Russia located on the Volga River, Tatarstan and its Sunni Tatar inhabitants have been a vector for Russian outreach to the Muslim world for centuries. This summer, Tatarstan's capital, Kazan, played host to a major forum, Russia and the Islamic World. The forum hosted guests from some 80 countries and events like a modest fashion day and a halal food expo. But under normal circumstances, the Kazan forum would barely register outside of Russia. This year, however, the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill, also traveled to Kazan to participate in the meeting. Perhaps the highlight of Kirill's visit to Tatarstan was a liturgical service over which he presided on May 19, 2023. Kirill traveled to Tatarstan with the Ark of St. George, venerated as a saint for the Russian military. And in his speeches, Kirill made splashes for deeming the so-called Renaissance a mistake. Today, Kirill argued Orthodox Christians and Muslims had to stand together against so-called destructive LGBT ideology and resist this tragic trend in the development of civilization, which forces God out of human life and imposes a different worldview where there is no God, just as they tried to do during the Renaissance. So Kirill's visit to Kazan represented one attempt to promote the supposedly peaceful coexistence of Orthodox and Muslims in Russia as a template for how Russia can form a conservative alliance with the rest of the Islamic world, Sunni and Shia alike. Yet, if Kirill and Kazan attempted to speak to all Muslim countries, another site in Tatarstan, not far from Kazan, provides us with a sense of how Russia is navigating its relations with Iran in particular. During the 1990s, Tatarstan established a special economic zone 2 hours east of Kazan, Alabuga, that attracted investments from Ford, McDonald's, and 3M. An on-site Alabuga Polytechnic would train students in industrial robotics, electronics, and biotechnology to serve these corporations. Yet after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, most international corporations withdrew their participation in the special economic zone. In their stead has come a factory to assemble the parts for Iranian Shahed military drones to be used in the war against Ukraine. According to independent Russian reporting this summer, the factory assembles parts from Iran in a space the size of 7.5 football fields. Next year, the factory is to more than double in size to produce components itself so that robots can assemble these drones for the war against Ukraine. These stories from Tatarstan remind us of how the bonds of faith and the sinews of war bind together Moscow and Tehran in their struggle against the United States and Ukraine today. But how inevitable was this constellation? After all, the two countries have a long and complex relationship, one marked by both Russian colonialism and Iranian ambitions to reject foreign ideologies. And Iran's Shia Islamist theocracy hardly seems compatible with a Russian federation whose constitution expressly forbids the establishment of a state ideology. So, over the last couple of years, as I've developed a project on Shia Islamism during the Cold War, I've grown intrigued about how we got from the world that I study, that of the 1970s and 1980s, until today. I've become intrigued by how Shia Islamist actors, those that went on to found the Islamic Republic of Iran and movements like Hezbollah in Lebanon, perceived the Soviet Union and eventually learned to work with it. So in today's lecture, I want to kind of combine some threads from my current research with some sort of more present remarks to explore these questions. And if I'm successful in the next 35 minutes or so, today when people in the elevator or in the dining hall or at your dining room table sort of ask you what you learned today, here are some things that you'll hopefully be able to take away. For one, the relationship between Russia and Shia Islamist movements over the last several decades has been one of mimesis. That is to say, even though we might tend to think of the two as opposites, they've often mimicked and copied one another just as much as they've rejected the other. For two, while both communism and Shi'ism claimed to offer a message of revolution and social emancipation during the Cold War, the end of that period, the end of the Cold War, has seen Russia and Iran double down on ideological conservatism. And 3, in Russia today, the Putin's claims to defend some kind of global conservatism, together with the Islamic Republic, is turning Iran itself into a byword for totalitarianism. So today I want to sort of explore these themes and ideas across 3 themes. And in doing so, I'm going to give you a sense of my approach to what I understand Russian and Eurasian studies to be, an approach that I dub transregional. That is to say, an approach that's attentive to Russia's encounters with the wider world, and one that looks at both state and transnational actors. And as we'll see, it's also one that relies both on sources in Russian, but also delves into the worlds of Persian and Arabic language sources as well. So kind of trying to remix the Russia-Eurasia component with the Middle Eastern component. I'm glad that we have, I think, some graduate students from the Middle Eastern program today. Still, that being said, I know that I'm likely the only thing standing between you and lunch, and so I'll try to tell this story in 3 abbreviated acts. And so I just want to say at the top that much has been left on the cutting room floor to kind of get this down to 40 minutes, and I'll be happy to expand on questions in Q&A. But for now, I want to dive into my first theme for today, namely the encounter between Shia Islamist movements and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So I think perhaps the best place to get started and just sort of establish a common language is with a sense of some of the terrains that we're looking at here. So when I think about transregional history or encounters between the Russian and Eurasian world and the Middle East, there's many different ways to do this. If we think about the ways in which these lands were once governed by empires, like the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, or the Safavid Empire, we might pay attention to the ways in which these imperial boundaries have structured the region. But on the other hand, if we focus on peoples like Armenians or Kurds, whose boundaries don't conform to those of modern nation states or past empires, we might get another picture. And indeed, river basins or tectonic plates or other forms of environmental approaches might suggest another way of looking at things. For today, however, I want to take a more religious approach and look at the world in the way that my actors, these sort of Shia Islamists, did. And that requires us to think in terms of what I dub the Shia ecumene, a space bounded by people and culture, not post-imperial lines, not the environment, and not national or ethnic boundaries. So just by way of background, in the wake of disputes over the succession to the Prophet Muhammad, early Islamic caliphates persecuted the descendants of Ali, one of the first Muslims, the Prophet's son-in-law, and according to some, his rightful successor. The Muslims who accepted Ali's claim to lead the caliphate came to be known as followers, or Shi'a, but they were marginalized in struggles over the leadership of the Muslim community. Many of Ali's descendants were killed over subsequent decades, leaving behind a chain, an archipelago of burial sites. Several of those who were poisoned were buried in Medina, others in tombs in Baghdad, Mashhad, and Samarra. Still others, such as his daughter Zainab, died of natural causes and were buried in a tomb near Damascus. It is because adherents to the largest school of Shi'ism believe in the authority of these 11 martyred imams, plus one hidden imam who has gone into occultation, are sometimes called Twelver Shia. Now, over the years, these places of burial became sites of pilgrimage and nodes in transnational networks of people, charitable giving, and commerce. Many of the settlements that arose around these Shia shrines came to host seminaries. Today, the most famous such seminaries are located in Najaf in Iraq and Qom in Iran, and they play a special role in maintaining the religious cohesion of Shi'ism, regardless of national boundaries. Now, historically, even as the Russian Empire expanded, it encroached but little on the core spaces of the Shia ecumene. It's true that the century from around 1722 to 1828 was a disaster for the Shia Safavid Empire and the Qajar Empire, the predecessors to Iran today. After all, the Russian Empire annexed virtually the entire Caucasus. Still, most of these Caucasian territories were inhabited by Sunni Muslims, Orthodox Christians, and religious minorities like Yazidis. By the early 20th century, Russia acquired a sphere of influence over northern Iran and even bombarded Shia shrines in Mashhad. These incursions inspired much anti-Russian sentiment among Iranians, but the core Shia domains were not yet directly threatened by the Russian Empire. Now, flash forward half a century to the Cold War and the transformation of the Russian Empire into the Soviet Union, and the picture changes quite a bit. For the fear of communism transformed the stakes for Shia activists. During the late 1950s, Shia clerics and students in places like Najaf and Qom feared that their countries would become satrapies or colonies of the Soviet Union. In most countries where Shia resided, the Shia sat at the bottom of the social pecking order. This made many young Shia receptive to communist claims to advance social emancipation, not least because communists could claim to offer a scientific theory of history. So for many young Shia activists, there was no contradiction between communism and their faith. As Talib al-Rifai, a future Islamist activist, recalled, "We all thought that communist thought went as far as Ali, and Omar ibn Yasser, and Abu Dhar al-Ghafari." And these names may seem unfamiliar to you, but the key thing to note is like these are kind of the core companions of Ali, like one of the key figures in Shia Islam. And so for young men at this time, in the late 1950s in Iraq, claims of social justice could just as easily be answered by communism or socialism as they could some kind of religious ideology. So between Nikita Khrushchev's outreach to countries like Afghanistan and an anti-colonial revolution in Iraq that brought communists into government, the prospects for the Shia ecumene seemed dim at first. And this perceived threat of communism would prompt a generation of young Shia activists to reimagine their faith for a world defined by a clash of ideologies. So throughout the 1960s, Shia activists wrote treatises about Islamic economics. They founded centralized Leninist political parties modeled on those of their enemies. And they turned to modern print media to spread their message. Since there was little in the way of a tradition of political Islam for Shi'ism, they borrowed much from the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt. But they also sought to find a balance between party structures and norms of authority so important to Shia. That's because Shia defer to clerics, sometimes known as ayatollahs, as so-called sources of emulation for important religious questions. Shia scholars often attain this rank only in their 70s or 80s. So imagine kind of a handful of undergraduates attempting to persuade emeritus professors to reform the department curriculum, much less become TikTok influencers, and you'll have sort of some sense of the challenge that these guys faced in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Making matters worse, the Septua and octogenarians by and large deferred to the authority of worldly rulers. They argued that no government could be fully legitimate, much less Islamic, until the return of the hidden Imam. Now, for all these reasons, Shia Islamist activists experienced the 1960s as a decade of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Where they managed to build Shia Islamist parties, as in Iraq, they faced state repression. A more dynamic Shia Islamist scene emerged in Iran under the leadership of a maverick Ayatollah, Ruhollah Khomeini. Yet, the success of the movement around Khomeini was far from predestined. Khomeini himself was exiled from Iran in the early 1960s, and his followers struggled to find a secure operating base somewhere in the Arab world. Cairo, Egypt, proved too committed to pan-Arabism and anti-Persian racism for Iranians to feel comfortable there. And in Iraq itself, much of the clerical establishment looked with skepticism on Khomeini and his movement. Even at the age of 65, Khomeini was something like a rogue adjunct professor among the leading clerics of Najaf. Even those clerics open to political activism could not understand why Khomeini and his followers were so opposed to the Shah of Iran, who, after all, had jailed or killed more communists in the region than almost anybody else. Only by the 1970s did things get easier for these Islamist activists. The emergence of the Palestinian revolutionary scene in Lebanon created a welcome footing for Islamists there. So too did Muammar Gaddafi's coup in Libya. But the most important change took place in Syria, which would assume an unlikely role as a crossroads for Shia Islamists and the Soviet Union. There, a November 1970 coup within the Syrian Ba'ath Party brought the defense minister Hafez al-Assad to power. In power, Assad sought to align Syria with the Soviet Union. Incidentally, China, Vietnam, North Korea, another story we can go into, but we're focusing on the Soviet Union today. The former commander of the Syrian Air Force, al-Assad, had trained on Soviet MiGs at air bases in Kyrgyzstan. And from 1970 to the late 1980s, tens of thousands of Syrians studied in the Soviet Union. Eventually, half of the Syrian Ba'ath Party's leadership became fluent in Russian. Moscow, for its part, courted Damascus through a number of channels. When it wanted to show its face as an anti-colonial empire, it dispatched one of its top Uzbek cadres, Nuruddin Mukhedinov, as ambassador to Damascus from 1968 to 1977. Here we can see Mukhedinov with his many family members and kind of donning Arab clothing. When Moscow wanted to highlight its commitment to religious freedom and the protection of Syria's religious minorities, it sent Patriarch Pimen I, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. and when it wanted to burnish its credentials as a paladin for Muslim interests, it sent the head of the Soviet Union's Central Asian Muftiate, the Uzbek Ziauddin Babakan. Later still, Moscow's ambassador to Syria was an Ossetian from North Ossetia. So when reaching out to the Middle East, but perhaps Syria in particular, Moscow could put on many faces, playing up its role as a multi-ethnic and multi-confessional polity. Now, the Soviet Union's outreach to Syria placed Shia Islamists before a conundrum. They were themselves dependent on the Assad regime for aid and assistance. The Assad family itself came from a religious minority close to the Shia. And in power, Assad transformed the country's Shia infrastructure. Recall, for instance, that the shrine of Zainab, the daughter of Ali and thus the granddaughter of the Prophet Muhammad, lies just outside of Damascus. Assad plunged resources into the renovation of the shrine and the seminary adjacent to it. Shia scholars, unwelcome in their own countries, found jobs there, while political activists were put up in spare rooms around the shrine. So, the Soviet Union endorsed Syria. Syria endorsed transnational Shia activists. But did this imply that Shia activists ought to adopt perhaps a better relationship with the Soviet Union itself? Here, opinions proved quite mixed. Some Shia actors close to Syria had no quarrel with Moscow. Take, for instance, Musa al-Sadr, an Iranian cleric who assumed leadership over Lebanese Shia institutions in the 1960s and 1970s. Al-Sadr was no friend of communism, but he saw in the Soviet Union a kind of post-ideological state that could potentially provide resources to his constituency. So, in the autumn of 1972, al-Sadr led a delegation to Moscow, pictured here, as well as to Baku and Azerbaijan, Samarkand, Khiva, and Bukhara, all in Uzbekistan. There, the same Soviet Mufti, Babakan, that had visited Syria, hosted him in Uzbekistan. And after his trip, the Shia cleric al-Sadr sent the Sunni Uzbek Mufti, Babakan, a telegram praising what he had seen in the Soviet Union. Readers of the Soviet Arabic language magazine, The Orbit, Al-Madar, could read al-Sadr's telegram to Babakan. Prior to the visit, explained al-Sadr, we were aware of the great efforts made by the Soviet Union toward promoting peace. Yet it's worth noting that what we saw during our relatively short stay throughout the Soviet Union exceeded what we had formerly known or heard. Al-Sadr went on to highlight the equal status of Muslims and other members of Soviet society. So for al-Sadr, Marxism-Leninism or communism may have been a misguided ideology, but, he wrote, the peoples of the Arab countries could look forward with hope towards the Soviet Union and seek its help in solving their issues. Other Shia activists, however, took a rather different stance. Among them were figures whom I dubbed Islamist internationalists, that is, activists who fused anti-colonialism with Islamic thought. You can see here, I have to sympathize with Brezhnev as somebody with large eyebrows, but a lot of these sources have these really incredible, very funny caricatures of them, so I couldn't resist. So, so distracted by the eyebrows. But so as one of these actors, as one of these Islamist internationalists, the Iranian pamphleteer and ideologue Jalaluddin Farsi explained, Leonid Brezhnev was the leader, that is to say the Imam of disbelief and the Imam of atheism. Iranians, he wrote, might tend to regard America as the great Satan. But in order to be true internationalists and live up to values of solidarity, they had to realize that for Uzbeks, for Afghans, and others facing Soviet imperialism, Moscow was the great Satan. So, anybody really committed to liberating the Ummah from foreign influence had to fight not only the United States, but also the Soviet Union. And for Farsi, Russia was an inherently expansionist power that would put on whatever ideological clothing or ideological garment, as he called it, to justify its imperial expansion. So any notion that détente or the Brezhnev period meant a turn away from revolutionary enthusiasm was misguided in Farsi's view. Soon, however, the Shia activists would have to turn these ideological positions towards the Soviet Union into the foreign policy of an actual state. Over the autumn and winter of 1978 and 1979, protesters in Iran forced the Shah to flee the country. He left on January 16, 1979. The Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran 2 weeks after that, on February 1, 1979. And within 10 days, the last vestiges of the monarchy collapsed. By the end of the year, Khomeini had been installed as the leader of a consolidating theocracy, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And yet, as I'll show in my second section, the 1980s would lead to an unexpected rapprochement between Tehran and Moscow. So, following the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Iranian Islamists, who we've explored a bit in the first section, moved quickly to dispatch with their opponents on the left. The Iranian Communist Party supported the Ayatollah Khomeini at first as an anti-imperialist figure, whom they thought would prove incapable of governing the country once the dust settled. But over the course of the early 1980s, the Iranian Islamists dismantled the Iranian Communist Party. They viewed Iranian communism as a fifth column that had to be destroyed without mercy. Before long, major Iranian newspapers like Atheism, pictured here, featured interviews performed under torture with leading communist ideologues, in which they admitted to the ideological bankruptcy of Marxism. And yet, when it came to foreign policy, Tehran's lines towards communist regimes was a bit murkier. Some figures within the regime, like the Islamist internationalists whom I work on, supported the worldwide export of the revolution, as they called it, even if this meant that foreign countries would cut ties with Iran. For these actors, Muammar Gaddafi's Libya offered the best model for how the Islamic Republic should evolve. They were, after all, revolutionaries and not diplomats, so it was imperative to support national liberation movements all around the world, no matter what the cost. Other figures within the regime, closer to al-Sadr, the guy that we saw in Red Square earlier, took a rather different line. The revolution was barely consolidated, they argued, and Iran needed all of the diplomatic support it could get from relevant Arab states, above all Syria. The Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan made them skeptical of Moscow, of course. But they thought if Iran was going to oppose the Great Satan, it could not burn all of its ties with countries like China, Nicaragua, or East Germany, much less the lesser Satan itself, the Soviet Union. So ultimately, over the course of the 1980s, this latter pro-Syrian faction would win out when it came to the orientation of Iranian foreign policy. Syria was the only major Arab country that supported Iran during its lonely 8-year war against Iraq. It offered the only route for Tehran to export the revolution to Lebanon and fight Israel there. And as the Reagan administration began launching preemptive strikes against countries it accused of supporting international terrorism, like Libya, Iranian elites distanced themselves from openly supporting groups that did things like airplane hijackings or bombings of civilian targets. Now, this turn away from international revolution on the part of the Iranian Islamists happened at a fortuitous time. That's because the Soviet Union was itself looking for a kind of geopolitical retrenchment by the mid-1980s. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev was appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He and his advisors were convinced that their predecessors had overextended the country through adventures in places like Angola, Ethiopia, and above all, Afghanistan. Rather than supporting quixotic third world causes, Gorbachev would look to repair relations with regional partners like China, India, and eventually Iran. And so, beginning in 1987, a number of high-level visits took place between Iranian and Soviet officials. In February of that year, the Iranian foreign minister made a visit to Moscow, one of the first high-level visits in many years. And when he met with Soviet officials, he argued that a so-called progressive arch was forming from Kabul and Afghanistan in the east to Tripoli and Libya in the west, with Iran in the middle. He sought, he said, to speak with the Soviet Union as the representative of a group of countries that may not exist yet, but would recommend itself as an Islamic, anti-imperialist, and anti-American force. This is a document, by the way, from the former Stasi archives in East Germany, and one of the kind of pleasures and adventures of this project has been kind of assembling a lot of documents both from the former Soviet Union, from Russian archives, memoirs of actors like in Persian and Arabic, but oftentimes for some topics, things like the GDR Foreign Ministry or even the Stasi intelligence archives contain these diplomatic documents. So one thing I'm happy to talk about in Q&A is kind of how one assembles this, this sort of puzzle of different documents. So the foreign minister of Iran wanted to do this kind of relationship between the Soviet Union and Iran, with Syria and Libya as partners. But they were no longer interested in overturning the world order in its entirety. They wanted to turn theirs and Moscow's good relations with Syria into the basis for a more formal partnership. Now, at first, the Soviets were very skeptical of this proposal, calling it megalomaniacal, or Großmannsucht, as it comes across in the German. Gorbachev and his team saw geopolitical retrenchment as a way to gain parity with the United States, and I don't think we're fundamentally anti-Western. But still, the Soviets were eager to court Tehran, lest it go in a pro-American direction after a succession crisis. After all, by this point in the late 1980s, the Ayatollah Khomeini was 85 years old and had survived multiple heart attacks. So it did not take an actuarial genius to realize that change was coming to Iran sooner or later. So Gorbachev did everything he could to bring the Iranians closer to Moscow. In January 1989, he received a delegation bearing a message from the Ayatollah Khomeini predicting the end of communism, seeing in it a sign that the Iranians wanted closer ties. Here we have a kind of a picture of the delegation, and it's worth noting that while this is composed of religious figures and diplomats, there's also this attempt to play up the role of Iranian women under the revolutionary regime as ambassadors for the country. This is a lady, Marzeh Hadidche, who died recently, but her memoirs are a really useful source into this whole episode and indeed into how women were key actors in this Shia Islamist scene. We saw another woman earlier, the daughter of an Iranian activist. So perhaps more on that in Q&A. So in the message that Khomeini sent and that this delegation brought to Moscow, Khomeini predicted the end of communism. But Gorbachev ignored the provocation and explained to the delegation that he saw the Soviet Union and Iran as doomed to good relations. Geography and skepticism of the United States meant that the two countries had no choice but to work more closely together. And a month later, Gorbachev's foreign minister, the Georgian Eduard Shevardnadze, here we have another Central Asian or Caucasian doing diplomacy to the Middle East, traveled to Tehran for an audience with Khomeini. The Ayatollah barely listened to the Soviet Union's top diplomat before getting up and leaving the room. But top Iranian elites confided in their Soviet colleagues that the meeting was a success. They had managed to show that the Imam was not fundamentally opposed to better relations with the Soviet Union. After all, no American had sat down with him. And so when Khomeini died late that evening on June 3rd, a day before the Tiananmen Square massacre and elections in Poland, there was no doubt that he had approved a course of greater openness towards the Soviet Union. Indeed, within a couple of weeks after Khomeini's death, the new Iranian leadership began to extend closer and closer feelers to the Soviet Union. So here, for instance, we have Hashmi Rafsanjani, one of the kind of key Iranian power brokers during the 1980s and eventually the president during the 1990s, here in a visit in Moscow in late June. And there's much more that could be said about this. What is Rafsanjani drinking in the photo? Among other things, the choice to do this in front of the Orthodox iconography and so on. But basically the point I want to get across to you is that this is not just about kind of establishing diplomatic relations, but it's really about a deepening of military to military ties as well. A lot of the sources that I've come across are from Iranian ambassadors to the Soviet Union who say basically, the Soviets were ready to give us a blank check on any kind of weaponry we needed at this point. So this is not only about kind of courting Iran into the pro-Soviet sphere, but establishing a military to military cooperation. Now, there were some problems with this diplomatic strategy on the part of the Islamic Republic. If your plan was to reach out to the Soviet Union and indeed its satellite states in Eastern Europe, the summer and fall of 1989 was, shall we say, not the best time to do this. So virtually all of the Eastern European states that Tehran built up relations with during this period collapsed in the autumn of 1989. Immediately before Ceausescu was killed, for instance, he had been in Tehran for like 2 or 3 days prior to coming back to Bucharest and giving his ill-timed speech in the Romanian capital. And of course, over the course of 1989 to 1991, the Soviet Union itself began to unravel. But rather than cheering on the independence of Muslim republics like Azerbaijan or Tajikistan from Moscow, Iranian elites by and large proceeded very cautiously. So for them, the Soviet Union was no longer an object of ideological enmity. It was rather a kind of geopolitical anchor, a sort of anchor of stability with which that they could approach the world. So I'm going to move on now to my third theme, the transformation of Russian-Iranian relations since the 1990s. So following the collapse of the Soviet Union and following the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, neither Tehran nor Moscow was in much of a position to challenge the world order. Here again, we have a nice illustration from these Islamist periodicals that have been my kind of reading diet for the last couple of years. This in the wake of the first Gulf War, alleging that President George H.W. Bush is turning Iraq and the Middle East into a American gas station, claiming that the so-called New World Order is nothing but a mask for American imperialism. And during this period, Iranian leaders devoted themselves to reconstructing their country after 8 years of war. They also embarked on reforms that we might call neoliberal of their largely statist economies. Harsh sanctions from the United States dating back to the revolution, but tightened under the Clinton presidency, isolated Iran from the world economy during a decade of globalization. Russia under Boris Yeltsin was likewise occupied with its own economic collapse and wars in Chechnya. Still, both states continued to trade with one another and, of course, maintained their ties with Syria. But at the end of history, there was still little in the way of ideology uniting the two states. Russia, after all, was moving in fits and spurts towards the West, and some spoke of a post-Islamist turn in the Islamic Republic. Now, while we don't have time today to go into detail on important episodes in the 2000s, like the US invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, this tendency remained true until the mid-2000s or so, I would argue. Iran may have asserted itself in countries like Iraq after 2003 or in Lebanon in 2006. And Russia obviously invaded Georgia in 2008. But as much as each state asserted itself in the Shia ecumene or within the former Soviet space, I think it's fair to say that they didn't think of themselves as operating in a joint key with one another. They were interested in reclaiming a sphere of influence, but not as a kind of common ideological project. And yet, starting in the early 2010s, Russia and Iran began to cooperate with one another more closely, and even resemble one another in ways that I think broke with historical norms. Historically, Shia and Russian actors mimetically copied their enemy in order to compete with them. But it was mostly the Shia actors that had done the copying of their communist adversary. During the Cold War, Shia Islamist actors had worried about their societies falling prey to communist influence. So they borrowed much from communist parties in turning their religion into an ideology and experimenting with centralized party structures. Now, however, Russian actors were looking with interest to Iran as an example of a state that combined religious theocracy on the one hand with the military power of paramilitary institutions on the other. Now, Russia was not about to adopt Shi'ism as its state religion, but an alliance between the Russian Orthodox Church and the state security forces could prove formidable. One key factor in this constellation at this time was the appointment of a new patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill, following the death of his predecessor, Alexei. As patriarch, Kirill began to throw his support behind Putin's regime, describing Putin's election in 2012 as a miracle and promoting the sacralization of Russia's military past and present. Under Kirill's patriarchy, the Russian Orthodox Church presented itself as an eager partner for the Russian state. By early 2012, moreover, with Putin campaigning for a third term as president following the Medvedev interregnum, there were ample opportunities for the Russian Orthodox Church to throw its weight behind Putin. Events like Pussy Riot's February 2012 performance inside of Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Savior and Putin's contested electoral victory prompted Putin and Kirill to legitimize Putin's rule in the name of so-called traditional values and conservatism. But it was in this context that Russian language commentators began to fret over how their country was beginning to resemble its southern neighbor. Beginning in 2011, but especially starting in 2012, liberal commentators in Russia began using the term Orthodox Iran, Pravoslavny Iran, to criticize the alliance between the Russian Orthodox Church and the power ministries. Now, as far as I can tell from research, this term may have actually, and somewhat oddly, originally come from Serbia in the late 1990s. Then liberal intellectuals used it to criticize Orthodox clerics who supported the Republika Srpska and Bosnian Serbs during the Bosnian War. But without having time to sort of understand or explore how the term migrated, here it was in full force in Putin's Russia, now being used for a different context and in the context of a state that was more closely actually aligned with Iran. And I've included just some examples of how this term begins to appear at this time. Soon, however, Russia and Iran did not just resemble one another in the minds of liberal intelligentsia. They were partners on the battlefield and models for one another's economies in deeper ways. In 2011, for instance, protests rocked the Syrian regime, Russia and Iran's main partner in the Arab world. By 2012, Syria was in the throes of a civil war. Tehran provided technical and military support for the Assad regime. And by the autumn of 2015, it was joined by the Russian Federation, which conducted airstrikes to aid Iranian and other Shia militias sent to prop up the Syrian regime. And although the Iranian intervention turned the Syrian civil war into a kind of Shia-Sunni sectarian conflict, Patriarch Kirill did not hesitate to put his own religious gloss on events, calling the intervention a holy war. Since the next conflict Kirill has described as a holy war, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, ties between the two countries have grown ever closer. Earlier, the Islamic Republic's 4 decades worth of evading Western sanctions seemed to be of little relevance for Russia, a country that was seeking economic integration with the West. But now, however, some combination of economic autarky and finding ways to turn countries like Armenia or Kyrgyzstan into hubs for sanctions evasions seems like a positive economic development strategy. And as it began, moreover, Russia's invasion has deepened the ideological alliance between the two countries and put Russia in a position of unprecedented military dependence on Tehran. Still, it's also deepening the ways in which Orthodox Iran does work as a negative metaphor for opposition forces in Russia. Following the invasion, for instance, Andrei Kurochkin, the archpriest of the Russian Orthodox Church in Spain and Portugal, criticized the war. Earlier this year, he was suspended for his positions. In a Facebook post earlier this year, Kurochkin explained his dismay and described how the Russian Orthodox Church was becoming the tool of a theocracy. The example of a modern society built on traditional values, he wrote, is Iran. The ideal Russia built on traditional values is an Orthodox Iran. In this paradigm, the head of the government is not only an administrator, but an ayatollah, independently interpreting spiritual materials, while the church merely acts as a relay. This is why the regime talks about how orthodoxy is closer to Islam than to Catholicism. And think back to Kirill's speech in Kazan, with which I started today. So I simply want to observe that while we shouldn't lose attention of Ukrainians as a protagonist in the Russo-Ukrainian war, it's also accelerated and deepened these patterns of Russo-Iranian alignment that began in the 2010s. Now, I've just about exhausted my time for today, and this talk has been intended as a kind of mix of research in progress and projects or possible directions for future research. And I realize that this material can be very dense. We're covering sort of large geographies and so on. So I hope that I've struck a balance between being accessible at times, but enough depth to sort of put some meat on the bone elsewhere. So for now, I'll just end with some questions on my mind that we might use as a jumping off point into our discussion for today. One is, if we're seeing today a turn in the Russian-Iranian relationship from a marriage of convenience into something more durable. Historically, relations between Moscow and Tehran have been more tactical than strategic, with the former viewing Iran as a bargaining chip for better relations with the West. But with Russia more isolated than ever and doubling down on a kind of anti-Western conservatism, are we seeing a turning point? Secondly, I'd invite us to consider what the impacts of the ideological alliance between Moscow and Tehran are on interfaith relations among Orthodox and Shia outside of the two countries. After all, both Orthodoxy and Shi'ism are larger than the Russian Federation or the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so one question on my mind is how this perversion of religion in the name of the state is affecting interfaith relations elsewhere, whether we're talking about Ukraine or Iraq or other major terrains for Orthodoxy or Shi'ism. And thirdly, another question is what the possible impacts on Russian and Iranian opposition movements may be as the Putin dictatorship and the Iranian theocracy identify themselves so closely with one another. Both regimes, as well as Syria, rely on one another to continue their despotism and prop up one another. But I wonder how this open articulation of a reactionary alliance is changing the ways in which ordinary Russians, Iranians, and others see their joint struggle against dictatorship and for some form of democracy. So these are some questions on my mind that we might use to jump into the discussion. For now, though, I'll thank you for your attention and look forward to our discussion, and thanks for having me. Yeah, so I think.
Do you want to moderate? It's a small enough.
Yeah, I think I've been told that me moderating is probably the best approach. So yeah, if people have questions or want to jump in, let's get started.
How many languages do you know?
Well, it depends. I think it depends on how much coffee I've had that morning. I mean, I think in some order, German has been a language of relationships for me, a language of love, perhaps. So that's probably the language I work with the most closely and know the best. But for this research, I rely on a mixture of sources in Russian and Persian. During my time at the Free University, I had the opportunity to begin studying Arabic and have profited a lot from working with memoirs and magazines and so on from the Arabic-speaking world as well.
That's impressive.
Thanks. It's really been, I think, thanks to the generosity of institutions like the Volkswagen Foundation and others. But yeah, I hope that there's something in the lecture that sort of shows what can happen if you are able to put these sources in dialogue with one another. Yeah.
Hi. I just love as someone with a personal academic interest in the Russian Orthodox Church, a little bit the interregional aspect of how you talked about that. Are there any particular sources you'd recommend about researching more into the modern interactions with the specific sources you recommend regarding the views you brought up about the theocracy in Russia, the Orthodox Iran stuff? How would you look more on that?
Yeah, thanks. This is really a bit out of my ballpark, and I think just for people in the room, I would highly recommend the work of a colleague of mine, Sean Griffin, who I've learned a lot from on the kind of transformation of the Russian Orthodox Church since, especially since the fall of the collapse of the Soviet Union. A lot of the stuff on Kirill and his appearances in Kazan were something that I learned much from exchanging ideas with Sean on. So it's not the kind of trans-regional history of the Russian Orthodox Church is not like my main area of strength, but I can give you a sense of how I would approach it if I were to pursue it in more depth. I mean, I think one thing that in this project that I think there's a lot of room for work on are the ROC's relations with different churches in the Levant in particular. I mean, I've highlighted how Pimen, when he went to Syria in 1972, was interacting with a variety of Christian churches in Syria. So, Maronites, Assyrians, and others. Although not within the ROC, there's obviously the Armenian Apostolic Church, which has its own kind of transnational links to Iran and other places in the Middle East. So I think my starting point would just be to simply kind of take advantage of the holdings at places at Thatcher. Look if there are kind of memoir collections. I think would be a place to start. But I think it's always helpful to think about the flip side. When we're doing transnational history or transregional history, it's important to remember that guys like Pimen then, or when Kirill went to Syria, I think in 2015 or 2016, they're interacting with Syrian counterparts. Or Pimen, after his trip to Syria in the 1970s, went to Jerusalem as well. So I think identifying, if you read the languages, identifying sources in, whether it's Arabic or Assyrian or other languages that other church leaders in countries like, say, Lebanon or Syria may have written as they interact with them. Obviously, the archival situation in Russia remains a real challenge today since the invasion of Ukraine. But up to the end of the Soviet Union, there were a lot of conferences and organizations for kind of church support for disarmament or church support for world peace. The precise name doesn't occur to me, but during the Cold War, the Soviet Union created and sponsored a lot of forums for inter-religious dialogue, ostensibly devoted to good causes like nuclear disarmament, but which were often used to influence policy in other countries. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Kirill was involved in some of these organizations in the 1970s or 1980s. So another way to kind of approach this question is to look at these state organizations, or at least their printed sources, which are going to be available in Russian, at least if we're looking at the Soviet side of the equation. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the lecture. As an Armenian, it really widened my viewpoint, I guess, because for us, in the way that we learn about history back at home, it really ends what comes to Russia and Persia. Or
Yeah.
ends there, so there is no Iran really coming up for us. I wanted to ask, because again, we view it as historical enemies, and we really don't don't study the past 19th century
Mhm.
and 1828 say, relationships. But I think I want to ask about the current dynamics after the war in Ukraine with Russia and Iran, particularly, I guess, centered more on Armenia.
Mhm.
Because it feels like there are some interests that both of the countries have that do not fully align. So sometimes, and these are two powers that can afford having their own interests as well. So I feel like there is more complexity in the relationships other than just being anti the West or the hegemonic powers of the West as it's called, right? So sometimes they can
Yeah.
also pivot here and there and fit it into there.
Yeah.
And I do say this based on what happened last year, for example, this year in September, when Azerbaijan attacked the eastern border of Armenia proper.
Mhm.
Actually, 4 days after the attack was stopped, and the statement by the MFA of Armenia that was put there was by international community help, and later on we learned that the international community is actually the US and Iran.
Mhm.
So it was a really interesting place to see how these two powers that haven't been talking for a while now
Yeah.
they're out there. And now you probably know the corridor situation
Mhm.
as well with the Zangiz and how
Yeah.
Iran is against Russia. They're putting their own peacekeeping troops in Armenia proper again. So just interesting to see how you see. And I guess this is also a question: will Iran let Russia, Azerbaijan attack Armenia? But yeah, no, that.
Yeah, no, I think for a lot of these, for some of these contemporary questions, I have to admit that I'm a bit perhaps below my pay grade. But I think as a historian, what I can say is I think one area for improvement, or like one thing I think there's a lot of room for further research on, is kind of disaggregating the Soviet Union as a unitary actor. I mean, I've attempted to do a little bit of that in this lecture today with highlighting, the Uzbeks, the Ossetians, and so on. But you're absolutely right to point out that, as much as one wants to talk about Iran as this, incredibly ideological state and Shia crescent and so on, the whole kind of Armenia-Russia relationship is an important piece of the puzzle that breaks a lot of these easy explanations. So one thing I just don't know a lot about, and I actually in Regensburg have been trying to find ways for an Armenian scholar to get involved in my research group, is precisely to take advantage, not take advantage, but to use the situation today where we can't go to archives in Russia and try to take advantage of archives or sources in Armenia to look at the ways in which the Islamic Republic interfaced with the South Caucasus during the 1980s. I think the only thing I can tell you from my research on this, insofar as it's come up in the book project thus far, is like in the early 1990s, there were attempts by the IRGC to back Azerbaijan in the first Nagorno-Karabakh war. But my understanding is, since then it's become a more, yeah. So I think, I mean, it's not my area of expertise per se, but I think it's like a great question, and particularly now as we're questioning the Russocentricity of the field. I think especially if you want to talk about these transnational connections with the Middle East, Armenia is obviously one of the places we need to start. Yeah.
I'm not sure how much you know about this, but the role of Russian Orthodoxy in the Russian nuclear system, do you think that Shia Islam could have a similar role in Iranian nuclear development?
Can you elaborate a little bit more by what you mean?
I just know I've done some research on the Russian Orthodox Church, and after the fall of the Soviet Union, they took the chance to regain influence, I guess, by integrating themselves into the nuclear system. I wasn't sure if you knew anything about that. But.
Yeah, I'm afraid that that's not something I really know very much about. Kirill, and again here I'm relying a lot on my friend Dr. Griffin's research. Kirill, from the very end of the Soviet Union, was very interested about reasserting the ROC within the armed forces, having military chaplains, and I've talked a bit about the ways in which he's described these conflicts, whether in Syria or in Ukraine, as holy wars, or claiming that people who die in them will have their sins washed away. But I'm afraid that what I know about this is really more focused on the conventional side. But likewise, as a historian who works mostly until the late 80s or early 90s, I just haven't come across so much on the history of the Iranian nuclear program, much less kind of entanglements of the clergy with it. But yeah, so sorry.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to know your point of view on their topic on this new Russian ideology that is called Russian World that is trans-religious, transnational. So they are trying to include different religious and different nationalities and their role in the present politics of Russia. Do you touch on this topic?
Well, certainly in this lecture, it's not necessarily like a focus of the book that I'm completing right now. I think one thing I would observe, or I think that this optic that I've adopted in the lecture helps us grasp is some of the contradictions in Russia's foreign policy and its attempt to articulate itself as a ideological pole. So, in Germany, where I reside and where I teach, a lot of Russian outreach has been focused on, right-wing parties like the AfD, and there's been a embrace, I would say, of anti-refugee or Islamophobic parties, playing up things like the Quran burnings in Sweden and so on. So it seems sometimes when Russia has been interfacing with right-wing European parties, sort of Islamophobia is no problem and is sort of a common ideological bond. And yet I think what is gained by having more of an attention to Orthodox actors, like I've done a bit of in this presentation, but also kind of interfaith relations between Orthodoxy and Shi'ism, is that when it comes to a lot of other domains, Russia is very keen to play up its kind of imperial legacy as a multi-confessional empire, as the only European country, arguably, that sort of has experience of being part of a Muslim polity and that can therefore speak to Islamic powers. So I think just one tension that emerges here is, on the one hand, this Russian pivot towards right-wing parties aimed at breaking up the EU, where Islamophobia is kind of a plus. And then if you look at the headlines or what's going on between Russia and Iran today, they're signing protocols against blasphemy, saying that sort of protecting the feelings of religious believers is one of the most important common causes that Orthodox and Muslims have to work on. So I think this contradictory nature or these sort of tensions within the ideology in Russia are just like a thing that analysts have to deal with today. But that's what really jumps out to me is this very ambivalent relationship towards Islamophobia on the one hand and a kind of Islamophilia, you might say, on the other. Yeah.
Thank you for this. I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you wrangle projects like this, right? Like this is, as somebody who works on trans-regional or global history, it seems very so expansive in terms of not just its geography, but also disciplinary boundaries, and you do very careful archival work that kind of reaches beyond the sort of what you might imagine as diplomatic history.
Yeah.
So what is the process of just kind of getting your bearings and kind of providing parameters around the project?
Yeah. Well, wow. How much time do you have? Yeah, I'll try to. In brief, I think one thing. For this current project, I think that just simply trying to kind of get inside of my actors' heads was a crucial starting point to understand the boundaries of the world as they understood it, what their historical reference points were, and going from there. Like at the very early stages of this project, I had access to the Afghan Partisan Serials collection, a digitized collection of Afghan Islamist magazines that was first at the Hoover Institution and I think is now available through Eastview as well. I just spent a lot of time reading these magazines, and some of the things these actors were talking about were familiar to me. They were not happy about Camp David. They didn't like the fact that Israel had invaded Lebanon. They didn't like the Soviets in Afghanistan. That was all relatively expected. But then what jumped out to me is they were talking about these Afghan activists from the 1950s and 1960s that I had never heard of. This guy Ismail Balkhi, who's like a really, really prominent Hazara activist in Afghanistan who is like not widely known outside of Afghanistan, but was super important for these actors. Or they would even produce kind of genealogies of the figures that they saw as like their leading inspirations for their Islamic revival, as they dubbed it. And so I think just one starting point was getting access to these digitized collections. That's something that changed a lot in the late 2000s and 2010s. Whether the Hoover Institution or initiatives like Afghan Data for Afghanistan, that enabled me to kind of get inside of the heads of these actors and then try to track down who they were talking about. I think the other thing when it comes to, at least speaking for Iran and Afghanistan, perhaps a bit less so for some parts of the Arab world, is I was really just surprised about the number of memoirs that these actors had produced. Iran in particular has a very rich memoir producing culture. My partner often jokes to me that there are all these sorts of portraits of curious actors sort of around the bookshelves of our apartment and so on. So these guys have been my kind of companion for the last couple of years. So I think trying to access these like ego sources and memoirs that have been published over the last couple of years. And then I think it just comes down to kind of triangulating those printed sources, whether periodicals or memoirs, with the state archives that are relevant for you in your case. Fortunately for this project, I was able to go to Russian archives, former Soviet archives, before the events of before the invasion, the full-scale invasion. So that helped a lot with the Soviet side of sources. And as mentioned, when we're trying to understand how these states like Iran dealt with the Soviet bloc, East German archives, but also Hungarian and Polish archives, I was able to use research assistants to gain access to those. So it's like ultimately a really messy process, I would say, but it's some kind of triangulation of these printed sources and these memoirs, of which there is an absolute ton, with the state archives to try to get at the question that you're answering. But I will admit that in this project, this wasn't necessarily the focus today, but it might apply to the earlier question about ROC. I think one of the most interesting questions for me in this research is what I would call like intra-Islamist relations. A lot of times, say, Lebanese Islamist activists would travel to Iran and write about things that they liked and things that they didn't like so much. And that can be a really exciting and rewarding process of putting like Persian and Arabic sources in conversation with one another. But like I can't lie that it's still really labor intensive and it just requires navigating an entire jungle of bibliography, of actually getting the books. And so if you find me on the 5th floor of crawling around on the 5th floor of Hatcher the next couple of weeks, that's probably what I'll be doing. Yeah.
Question. So I know you were trying to cover a lot in the talk, but I kind of wanted to go back since we have a little bit of time to one of the points with this the term of this Orthodox Iran, and you had mentioned that it probably originated more during the Serbia war and in Bosnia, and I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that origin of it. I know that that's a little bit out of the range, but since it was then adopted by Russia as well, like this terminology, like how that.
Yeah, I'm afraid that I really don't know very much more other than what I said in the lecture. I've been kind of just Googling and Yandexing this for the last several weeks because I became intrigued by this, and as the title indicates, it's such a striking pendant to the constellation of the 1970s, where we have Brezhnev as the Imam of atheism. If memory serves, and this I could have some of the details off here, there was I believe, Serbian Orthodox bishop in either Serbia or Montenegro, I think at the time it was still one country, who was very pro Republika Srpska, and then after Dayton was kind of claiming that Milosevic had, abandoned the Serbian cause in Bosnia. And I think he was maybe later deposed after this. I forget the exact story. But essentially, this was a guy, a Serbian Orthodox priest who was, essentially a Serbian nationalist and was very interested in kind of Orthodox unity within the Balkans. And as the Milosevic regime began to crumble or became weaker in the late 1990s, I think commentators in Serbia or Yugoslavia at that time were just concerned about this fusion of right-wing nationalism with a sort of Orthodox chauvinism. And given that some version of that is what has happened in Russia in the last couple of years, that is where it seems to come from. I think in order to go into more depth, I'd have to sort of plunge into periodicals and the blogosphere, or like magazines and newspapers of 2000s Russia, which would definitely be a worthwhile task, perhaps one if I turn parts of this or spin off parts of this into a future project. But that's kind of the limits of what I know
It's
now.
definitely not a coincidence.
Yeah.
With Russia, because of the
Yeah.
ties with the Russian
Absolutely.
Serbian Orthodox Church.
Yes.
Right? And so it would be kind of interesting to explore that because probably, because of the contentious, let's say, relationships with probably Islam as well, and Islamophobia. And
Right. Yeah.
Very similar ones, right? To if you think of kind of not a historian, but of present day Russia and present day Serbia, kind of the Islamophobia that happens within those countries, and that system of othering, et cetera. That's tied
Yeah.
to. So it would be, it was in the title. So I thought it would give you a chance to kind of tell a little bit more about that.
Yeah. No, I think this connects with the earlier question about sort of Ruski Mir or different registers of Russian imperialism. Again, here I think the paradox is whereas it's sort of, again, not a specialist in the Balkans, but it seems kind of easier or more convenient to be a Islamophobe as a Serbian nationalist, whereas given just the scale of Russia, given the existence of places like Tatarstan, and just a very different set of geopolitics, there is this need to, take on certain Islamophobic registers, whereas the regime is obviously interested in presenting this more Islamophilic face to the outside world.
And the influence of Iran in Bosnia, essentially.
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
The establishment of Islamic centers.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
My name is Ahmad. I'm from Uzbekistan, and you enlightened me a lot about information and so on. So is there any way AI can be related to this in terms of data acquired? And would it be possible to make your book like AI so anyone can ask the question and then spits out an answer? So what do you think on this? Just merging AI with what you're doing?
Yeah, I think it might seem a bit unrelated at first glance, but absolutely. One of the master's theses I supervised in the last couple of years when I was in Berlin was by a young scholar, Lisa Pogel, who looked at Soviet ethnographic magazines from like the 1950s to the 1980s. And she was really interested in Soviet theories of ethnogenesis, like Gumilyov and kind of this discourse, right? And she, took this huge periodical base, found a way to do OCR on it, and she was really interested in certain collocations of words that are maybe more common at certain times and less common at other times, or in some cases like hand code descriptions of things. For instance, if we're talking about so-called mountain Tajiks, sort of Gorni Tajiki, are they coded as backwards or sort of remnants of backward civilizations or something, or are they coded as modern or something? And so while that was focused on a very specific and different topic of kind of discourses around ethnogenesis and ethnic difference in the Soviet Union, to me that was a really powerful example of how OCR, when wedded to these large corpora of text, in my case a lot of these Islamist magazines, can generate really useful results. So I know there are people like at Princeton who are doing more work on this. My understanding is that my sense, which could be out of date, is that OCR for some Persian and Arabic is more difficult still than for Cyrillic or Latin. But just having spent a lot of the last several years kind of immersed in these magazines and memoirs, I think there'd be a lot of room for exploring different collocations. Like one term that some of my actors in this book describe is they'll talk about kind of the liberation jihad that they need to wage in Afghanistan. This kind of wedding of third worldist registers and terms with terms from a more Islamic register. And by the late 1980s, I see some of this discourse going out the window, but I don't really have from a social scientist point of view, perhaps, I don't necessarily have a robust or at least quantitative way of kind of proving this, let's say. So I think, as much as we might revel in the diversity of sources that we've talked about, and there's this focus on multilingualism, et cetera, I do think that like kind of computational techniques do have a lot to bring to the table, especially when we're trying to ask questions about how ideologies change or emerge or disappear over time. So yeah, I think absolutely.
This gave us a lot to think
Yeah.
about. To ponder. Lucky for us, you're still here at Michigan for a couple of weeks. So we can also try to connect as well. And, thank you very much. A round of applause.
Thank you.